Good morning, Mr. Old.
Good morning, my lady. Before we resume today, there are a number of witness statements relating to week 3 evidence that we ask your permission to adduce into evidence and to be published on the inquiry's website. If I could ask that the list of documents be brought up onto the screen, please. These documents provide important additional contextual information and background, which, my lady, we hope will assist you when considering the evidence that you've heard in this investigation and for your report.
Very well, they may be published. Thank you, Mr. Old.
Thank you, my lady. Our next witness and our first today is Mr. Chris Young. May the witness be sworn or affirmed, please.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Please state your full name for the inquiry.
My full name is Christopher Young.
Thank you, Mr. Young, and thank you also for providing to the inquiry a witness statement. Its references INQ 000563070. It's a statement that runs to 20 pages and is signed, I believe, by you at the back of it. Could you confirm for us, please, that it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm that is true.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young. By way of background, your background, we know, I think, from your witness statement that you first joined the finance function of the Department for Health and Social Care in 2005. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Thank you. And in 2014, you became a senior civil servant, specialising in the finance profession as Deputy Finance Director. Is that also correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And you were appointed Director of Finance at the DHSC in August 2017. And in January of 2020, you became the Capital Director of Finance at DHSC.
Correct.
And then finally, you, in terms of your background, your credentials, your experience, you are a member, are you not, of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants?
I am, yes.
All right. That's very helpful. Thank you. In terms of accounting officers or fellow accounting officers, at the outset of the pandemic, there were 2 of these, were there not? Mr. David Williams and Sir Chris Wormold.
So Chris Wormold was the Principal Accounting Officer and David Williams was the Second Permanent Secretary, also Accounting Officer, correct.
And you tell us that during non-pandemic times, the number of AO assessments, accounting officer assessments undertaken in DHSE was minimal. Why is that? If you could just explain the difference between business as usual and the circumstances with which we were all presented during the pandemic.
So essentially the rule book for accounting officers, their roles, their responsibilities, including an accounting officer assessment, is set out in Managing Public Money. Essentially that's Treasury's rule book on how government departments should manage the public purse. Within that document, it sets out the rationale of why and when accounting officer assessments are necessary. In simple terms, when something new is novel and or contentious enough to warrant an accounting officer, who is often one of the most senior civil servants in a department, to undertake a rounded assessment to give their personal endorsement or not on whether something should go ahead. In ordinary non-pandemic times, the role of the Department of Health and Social Care didn't necessarily mean that those sorts of assessments were needed on a frequent basis. From memory, the time that one was necessary prior to the COVID pandemic was in the possibility of a hard Brexit scenario. But outside of that, the department was not making significant purchasing activities to warrant the need for an accounting officer assessment. So they were few and far between leading up to the pandemic itself.
All right, thank you for that. You've mentioned managing public money. We'll come back to that document in a few moments, and I'll be inviting you to explain the extent, if any, to which the circumstances of the pandemic affected how the guidance contained therein was to be applied. But before we get there, can I just explore with you relatively briefly the unique circumstances that were created by the pandemic, so far as your work was concerned? The inquiry has already heard significant evidence to the effect that the economics of the supplier market was significantly imbalanced. There was global demand for PPE, which vastly exceeded the supply that was readily available. That's right, isn't it?
That's right. That's my understanding, yeah.
And this was, and it's that demand that overwhelmingly influenced some of the decisions that you and your fellow AO colleagues needed to make. Is that right?
Sorry, could you just explain?
Yes, the demand for PPE, the urgent need for PPE, resulted in significant influence on the judgments, the discretions that you will come on to the specifics of this in a few moments, had to make in relation to particular offers.
The scarcity of supply and the need to adopt a heightened risk appetite to essentially maximise our chances of securing the scarce PPE meant that when accounting officers took their overall assessment, they did have to take into account A, that risk appetite, but B, also what that meant in terms of the scarcity of the product itself. So the contextual market which you've described was an important factor in terms of A, applying the managing public money principles, but B, bringing in that risk appetite that was set essentially by the Prime Minister from the outset of the pandemic.
And as you've already explained, and you explain also in your written evidence, AO assessment and approval needed to be more frequent. It was more urgently conducted than in peacetime. And compared to business as usual, there was less opportunity and time for inspection and quality control, testing of goods before delivery, wasn't there?
So in terms of my personal role, the reason I got brought into delegated accounting officer responsibilities was because of the volume and pace at which accounting officer assessments were required, which far exceeded business as usual times, to your point, but also far exceeded what was practically possible from one individual, which was David Williams at the time.
I think that's a yes to my question.
Hence the delegation to myself, yes. So the frequency and pace at which we were taking decisions was higher than you would ever imagine.
Less opportunity and time for inspection.
Less opportunity and time for inspection because the cost of inaction in terms of decision making meant that deals would be lost because we were competing with every country around the world.
Understood. Understood. Contracts required substantial upfront payments in advance of receiving the goods on many occasions.
Correct.
And AO approvals were given at short notice. Yes. And those that were in excess of £100 million were handled by David Williams.
So David remained responsible for any decision over 100 million. Below that was myself and a colleague.
I think Mr. Williams says that he handled a total of 10. So there were that number that exceeded the £100 million threshold. It follows, therefore, that the remainder fell to you and Mr. Fundry.
I've seen some evidence that suggests around 400 contracts were signed between March 2020 and July 2020. If only 10 of those fell, that would suggest that the vast majority fell to myself and John Fundry. Those are just contracts that were approved, so that number wouldn't include ones that were rejected. So you Indeed. Are correct, yeah.
And was that workload, broadly speaking, split 50-50 between the two of you?
We operated a shift rota because one of the operational adjustments that was necessary from the outset was to cover non-UK business times because we were operating in a global market. So essentially, an accounting officer needed to be available from roughly 7 a.m. through to 10 p.m. 7 days a week. So John and I, between us, organised a rota period which ensured that there was at least one accounting officer available at all times, 7 days a week, 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. When the deals fell would depend. So the split of work, the time split was 50-50, but where the deals felt, it wasn't within our control.
I'm assuming that over time you ended up doing, broadly speaking, a roughly equivalent number of considering a roughly equivalent number, or authorising a roughly equivalent number of offers.
I don't have those facts in front of me. Sorry.
It's not critical. In terms of your training, you, as we've touched on, you're a qualified finance professional with knowledge of MPM, managing public money. You're experienced in AO work, aren't you? Mm-hmm. You're aware of the significant amounts that the DHSC budget deployed each year on the procurement of medical equipment and supplies.
So my finance director role, prior to it being split in January 2020, had oversight of the funding flows out with the system, the NHS, etc. So I was aware of the levels of money that ordinarily are spent on NHS procurement activity.
And you have a knowledge of UK government procurement processes and frameworks as well, don't you?
I have a knowledge, yes. I'm not a commercial expert. I'm not commercially qualified, but I had a knowledge.
That's business as usual. So far as non-business as usual, or the extreme circumstances that prevailed during the pandemic, neither you nor, for that matter, any of the AOs had specific training or experience, understandably, in emergency procurement. Is that right?
That's correct. I think I would characterise the requirements of the AO during the pandemic as unprecedented. And in fact, managing public money specifically sets out that principal decision-making in unprecedented circumstances is something that an AO may be expected to do. I would characterise COVID-19 and the pandemic as unprecedented. So the parameters in which an accounting officer would take decisions stand the test of time, whether it be in an emergency or a non-emergency, but the conditions and the specific conditions themselves were unique.
Nor did you have guidance or training on working together, for example, in order to achieve a consistency of approach between yourself and Mr. Fundry. I know that you were in frequent contact with each other, but that wasn't following guidance or training, was it?
The answer is no. However, I think it's important to note that both John and myself and David were all working from the same managing public money playbook in terms of the criteria in which an accounting officer would adopt. We were all working from the same data when it came to the scarcity of products, and we were all operating within the same consistent risk appetite set by the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary. So there was no guidance, but with those common conditions in play and speaking regularly to each other several times a day, and my personal experience working with David Williams goes back many years, so there was no guidance on working together effectively, but we essentially were all working from the same playbook.
You mentioned the Health Secretary. Could we bring up onto the screen a letter from the Health Secretary of the 29th of March 2020, in which he says to Sir Chris Wormold, it's the penultimate paragraph, "I recognise as part of this the work you and your teams have been doing with colleagues in the Treasury to ensure that availability of funding is not a barrier or delay to the actions we need to take. On that basis, and recognising the extraordinary circumstances this country is facing, I am content to direct you to continue in this way, even where this means spending in excess of formal departmental expenditure limits." Now, Mr. Young, you comment on this in your written evidence. You say that in relation to these words, this approved spending that may result in a regularity breach. Do you remember that phrase that you used?
Yeah.
What did you mean by that, the regularity breach?
So I think the really important bit of context in terms of what we're looking at on screen now is the date. And the date, the 28th of March, in proximity to the end of the financial year, which was the 31st of March. Now, the timing of that is significant in terms of this specific request of the Health Secretary at the time, because what was potentially happening is that the efforts that were being undertaken to safeguard ourselves in terms of the pandemic may well have led to the Department of Health breaching its agreed revenue and capital departmental expenditure limits, which run from the 1st of April to the 31st of March. And that would mean that would create a situation where that spending in Treasury terms would be deemed irregular. So that's a Treasury term where you don't specifically have Treasury or parliamentary approval to spend. So this direction was giving clarity to both Sir Chris Wormold and Sir Simon Stevens that they should not stop spending in the last couple of days of the financial year to simply live within the agreed expenditure limits. So that essentially, a ministerial direction, again, is very, very rare in non-pandemic times, but this was directing Simon and Chris to continue doing what was necessary, even if that meant spending irregular amounts of money beyond the agreed budgets for the final few days of the financial year.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Young. I said I'd come back to managing public money, a document to which you've already made reference, and I do that now. I don't think we need to bring it up. Well, there it is. It's on the screen. You set it out, actually, you set out the key parts of it in your written evidence at paragraph 25, which is at page 6. And the four key features or requirements are regularity, propriety, value for money, and feasibility, deliverability. As I'm sure you're very familiar with these. First question is, did the ministerial direction have any bearing on those requirements within the NPN?
The ministerial direction, as I say, was specifically around the departmental expenditure limits in that last few days of that financial year. Related to that direction and an exchange of information between David Williams and Matt Hancock at the time, the risk appetite essentially was set in terms of how we may apply the key criteria within managing public money. So that the submission I've referenced in my statement from David Williams to Matt Hancock essentially put on record that we may well have to take a higher risk appetite when it came to accepting that certain stock may not end up being what we thought it was. We would have to take a higher risk appetite when it came to value for money. None of which meant that we wouldn't necessarily have to put in place safeguards or consider those things appropriately. But what it was saying is that we would have to, by necessity, take a higher risk appetite when it came to either the feasibility of a deal and or value for money in a deal. So it didn't take away the need to assess deals on the key criteria within managing public money, but it did set the context for where the risk appetite is.
So can I take from that, let's leave the ministerial direction to one side for the moment. Mm-hmm. Let's focus, as you have in your last answer, on the higher risk appetite. There are four principles that we are now discussing arising out of managing public money: regularity, propriety, value for money, feasibility or deliverability. Can I take it from your last answer that regularity and propriety remain unchanged despite the higher risk appetite, but those latter two, value for money, feasibility, stroke deliverability, need to be judged in the context of that higher risk appetite?
That's a fair summary. So we made all attempts to ensure that regularity and propriety remained in high regard, and that included seeking the appropriate approvals from Treasury ministers. That included taking all action as possible to remain within the right regulations and statutory requirements, and having an effective governance process as far as was practical. When it came to feasibility, feasibility was very challenging in the circumstances that you set out earlier, in that we were operating in an international seller's market. It was very, very difficult, therefore, to assess with any full degree of confidence that the deal that was presented to you would arrive fully as expected. In those circumstances, it was not possible to eliminate risk. It wasn't practical or possible. We did take steps to minimise risk, by which I mean thinking about an incredibly important point around never letting unsuitable PPE get into the NHS distribution system. So even if substandard products did ultimately arrive, there would be a clinical check on arrival. It would never be put into the distribution of the NHS. And we would also look at the commercial remedies. So there was some commercial recourse for where deals didn't necessarily come through as we would expect.
And by the former, just to be clear, I understand you to mean, in your answer and in your written evidence, that where the risk appetite increases and it results in a given case in inadequate PPE arriving, there is a certainty that that would not make its way into the system.
That was my understanding. So my understanding was that where we were taking higher risk in terms of the feasibility of a deal, there would always be appropriate safety nets in place to make sure that if that risk crystallised, that would not result in unsuitable PPE being put out into the system.
Understood. Can we turn now, you talk about the challenging circumstances of this market, and I want to focus a little bit on the challenging experiences that you personally had on a day-to-day basis. You tell us, Mr. Young, at paragraph 24 of your written evidence, that on an average of 3.74 contracts per day were processed. I think you're talking about either above or below the £100 million threshold, are you?
I think that was based on the information I had available to me, which was 322 contracts between March and June 2020, per my statement. So I think that's an average.
It could be either.
It could be higher, it could be lower.
It's a far smaller number above that threshold.
It is.
As
correct.
you'd expect.
Correct.
And then you add that you're also informed that the most approvals on a single day was 11, which happened, I think, towards the end of the PPE buying window, 18th of May 2020, and again on the 1st of June 2020. This is your paragraph 24. Mm-hmm. That is towards the end of the buying window, isn't it? So far as PPE is concerned.
I am not entirely sure on that, is my answer. My personal experience, I left my role, as we're talking about today, in July. That felt like a point where things were normalising, right, in terms of we were able to take less risk when it came to value for money and feasibility. March, April and May still felt like a period to me where there was heightened risk and there was still a large volume of purchasing going on. So perhaps the second, second date you referenced, which is the 1st of June. But to me, May still felt like a period where there was still a heightened risk appetite and lots of purchasing going on.
All right, let's try and get a better sense of what it was that you would need to do in order to approve. It wouldn't have been 11, it wouldn't have been you with sole responsibility for 11, but it might have been you dealing with something like half that number.
Yep.
Yeah. You had a vast quantity of material to consider at speed, didn't you?
My role, the accounting officer assessment, came at the end of what I think this inquiry has heard is an 8-stage process.
That's right.
So the information that came through to the accounting officer, there was a lot of information that came through in the actual request for an approval, most of which was included for completeness rather than an expectation or a need to go into every single detailed document attached. That's because usually the team at stage 7 brought together everything and provided a summary to the accounting officer that then enabled them to take that information apply the contextual knowledge they had from the demand data and the risk appetite and form a view on the deal in itself. There was a lot of information contained in the requests, but as I say, most of it was usually there for completeness.
So let's, just as for completeness, let's just look at the constituent parts of what's described as an AO pack.
Yep.
And perhaps you could indicate whether it's a document that you would have had regard to, whether you would have looked at, or whether it was something that was there for completeness and you wouldn't necessarily have spent time considering.
Yep.
So terms and conditions, including evidence of acceptance or a summary of terms, highlighting the risks, reasons, and subsequent external law firm legal advice if sought. Is that something you'd have looked at?
I think it's, if I could answer the very simple question, the AO pack was essentially the one-stop shop which summarised all of the key information the accounting officer would have expected to have been assured throughout the previous 7 stages. So if that pack signalled that something had been done, the accounting officer would not then go and interrogate that detailed document in the actual in the information that came up. We had to, and I had to, place my assurance in the experts that came before in the process. It was not the role, nor was it practically possible for me to get under the skin or undermine or oversee the detailed points within.
So that is not a document or a set of documents that you would have scrutinised?
Not if the AO checklist suggested that that assurance had been done.
All right. We may get similar answers to the other elements. The department's order form.
Yeah, you will get similar answers.
We will.
Because, essentially, the checklist provided the accounting officer with the assurance that everything that he or she would have expected in the previous 7 stages had been done.
Let's just go through them so that you can confirm at least that they normally formed part of an AO pack, whether or not you would scrutinise the document itself. Notification of any advance or upfront payment required in the contract.
Yep.
Included, you wouldn't necessarily scrutinise it unless the front of the AO pack revealed some irregularity.
That's an important point, because when it came to upfront payments, which for context in non-pandemic times are usually not a thing that the government does, the Treasury and the Cabinet Office both accepted that upfront payments were absolutely necessary, but we did get asked to try and keep them to a minimum. Now, we effectively had no leverage on price, but we could try, or we did try, to keep upfront payments to a minimum. So having a look at what the percentage of the overall contract price was requested in the form of an upfront payment was something that I would have specifically looked at.
Included in the pack is the department's new supplier form, including bank details, yes?
That's a standard due diligence check that is necessary. I wouldn't have checked that myself.
A PDF supplier letter containing bank details?
Again, a standard control that you would expect with any new supplier.
Approval by the clinical and product assurance or approval through the MOD quality assurance, yes?
Yep.
Technical documentation including photo and certificates for items?
Correct.
Department's requisition form?
Correct.
Foreign currency payments form if appropriate?
Correct.
Supplier quotation including a comparison to the average price benchmark process and an explanation of why the offer was reasonable or better to proceed in the circumstances.
Yep. Again, that was an important point that I would have looked at in probably a little more detail, insofar as we talked earlier around feasibility, one of the four criteria of managing public money. We talked about feasibility being very difficult to assess. Value for money was another area that necessarily we had to take some heightened risk, because we had effectively no leverage when it came to price. So what we did try to do is safeguard the public purse as best as is possible by having a rolling 7-day average as a benchmark on price. And that would be something that the accounting officer would pay specific attention to, because if something was out with that 25% benchmark, it would not necessarily mean that that deal would be rejected, but it may well cause rise for a query or a comment on the deal itself.
Last two items, FCO approval for the company concerned and the submission to the DHSC checklist.
Correct.
And it's the submission to the DHSC checklist that you would primarily have focused on, is it?
That's right.
Yeah. That's the sort of cover sheet or pages beneath which lie those other documents that we've itemised. We'll look at one or two of them in due course.
Yeah.
So you relied, I take it from your answers, that you relied to a significant extent on the judgments that had previously been made along the 8-stage process.
Yeah, the accounting officer came at the end of that process. We were independent and separate from the work that went on prior to that, which I think was helpful in respect of maintaining that independence. We weren't sucked into unnecessary detail or influenced unduly. So at the end of the process, you could take a factual view of a deal. You could therefore apply on top of that the demand signalling information on the product and the risk appetite and come to a rounded view using the principles of managing public money.
We touched in earlier evidence in this module on a 2-week period after which offers should either be disregarded or in exceptional circumstances continued in the system. Was that something that concerned you, or did that only relate to earlier stages in the 8-stage process?
I can't recall that 2-week period ever being something that came to my attention.
So you would simply consider an offer as it reached your desk?
Correct.
Yeah, all right. Was, in your view and on reflection, was there scope for any form of data analysis tool that might have helped you in your work, either by filtering out irrelevant material or providing focus that would have streamlined the work that you had to do?
I mean, I think essentially that the accounting officer assessment, as I've said, came up right at the end of a process which I understand this inquiry has made specific challenges on over the previous weeks. What I would say is that I don't personally feel that the final stage, the accounting officer assessment, was in any shape or form a bottleneck to that process. There were times where the constraints of email, in which was the form on the route that decisions came for approval, there were times where the constraints of email may have slightly slowed down things. I would say as well that the demand signalling data that the accounting officers used in terms of applying the context, the demand itself, there was a clear expectation and understanding that data was not perfect. So if I was going to go anywhere in terms of what may have been more helpful at the time, it would have been to have even more confidence in the data around the specific products, by which I mean the inventory data, the inbound orders data, and the actual usage data itself, because there was an understanding that data was imperfect.
And its imperfections, given what you tell us in your written evidence, must have been a very serious problem. You said that you, at paragraph 36, you say it's no exaggeration to say that I had a daily and real balance to strike between my AO responsibility as a custodian of the public purse and, towards the end of that sentence, saving lives. And then you say lower down at paragraph 57 that you had to conduct what you describe as basic sniff tests, yes?
No, I think that's two slightly confusing, two slightly mismatched things there. So your first point around an accounting officer having a real trade-off between protecting the public purse,
yes,
and making sure that ultimately the overall objective, which was to buy enough PPE to save lives, was met.
Striking that balance.
Really important to note that we were spending amounts of money that were unthinkable in non-pandemic times. And that didn't sit well with someone who spends many years of their career trying to do the best in terms of protecting the public purse. So we had to take a choice at times, and we knew those choices would not get it right every time from an accounting officer perspective. Your second point around paragraph 57 of my my statement in terms of
it says actually it's the table that meets the basic sniff.
The basics that is essentially is in the context of the three accounting officers collectively agreeing with the SROs of the programme, Jonathan Marin and Emily Lawson, that we would have to, in the context of losing deals because of the pace of the 8-stage process, we were looking to streamline wherever we possibly could. Now, what that meant is, not even though I mentioned earlier that the accounting officer assessment wasn't a bottleneck in that overall process, it didn't mean that we still shouldn't look to streamline the process where we could, which meant that the three accounting officers decided to pass delegation down to the team who were recommending deals to myself, to David, to John, that if a deal clearly met the conditions placed upon us by the Treasury, and there was no real judgment, no accounting officer judgment needed, we were content to provide them with approval to sign off that deal. So that's the term may meet the basic sniff tests, essentially. Could I have used some crisper language in hindsight? Yes. Did I get any challenge back or questions from the team on what I meant? No. So it was clear at the time what we were doing, which the intent of that specific paragraph was to set out the continual attempts to streamline the full end-to-end process, including stage 8, even though that in itself was an efficient part of the process.
You were liaising with other members of the team, with Mr. Williams and Mr. Fundry regularly, were you?
Oh, we spoke many times a day, including with the team. We were operating at distance, remotely. We were able to operate effectively, though, due to the technology allowing that. So multiple team
Would
calls.
you seek guidance from Mr. Williams on occasion?
I wouldn't say seek guidance. David had been an accounting officer and had been an experienced accounting officer for a number of years. In the very, very earliest part of the pandemic, so we're talking early March, there may well have been some discussions to check that David was content with the approach that was taken. But essentially, David Williams set the blueprint for everything that came after that in terms of his approach and his documentation to some of the earliest deals, which, to put on record, were done alongside working with the Treasury rather than out with the Treasury. So David essentially set the blueprint, which didn't therefore necessarily mean that John or I needed to check anything with him after that.
As to Mr. Williams's approach, he tells us in relation to, I think, 3 matters, what his approach was. The first is whether financial links between a supplier and a referrer were, as he saw it, relevant in the decision to progress a contract. And he says this in his written evidence: the relationship between a referrer and a financial backer of the supplier had no effect on my decision to approve contracts, which had been through the high priority lane. You wouldn't disagree with that as a matter of approach, would you?
Oh, I'd absolutely agree with that approach. The high priority lane and referrers were not a specific matter that any of the accounting officers concerned themselves with. And I think when I referenced the accounting officer decision coming at the end of a process, I think that was very helpful in maintaining that independence. It didn't matter to me personally where a deal had been referred from or to. What mattered to me is that the appropriate assurances that came within the first 7 stages had been undertaken and the deal was being recommended on the basis of it being a sound deal.
He says this in relation to profits. Similarly, the level of profits of the supplier and distribution of profits had no effect. Given the sharp increases in the global prices of PPE, we knew that significant profits were being made due to supply and demand. That's his paragraph 72 of his second witness statement. You wouldn't agree with that, disagree with that either, would you?
No, if you look at some of the pre-pandemic prices for specific items of PPE and compare them to the average prices we were paying during the pandemic, it was clear that huge profits would be made. That was unavoidable. Again, the overall objective here was to ensure that we bought the amount of PPE that was necessary to save lives and ideally minimise the overall economic cost of the pandemic by shortening the period at which things were happening.
And of course, so far as pricing was concerned, your concern was to achieve value for money rather than interrogate what the profit margin might be of the vendor, which is something that it was likely in any event to be a fruitless exercise in determining. Is that right?
That's right. We as I said earlier, we had effectively had no leverage when it came to price. And that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't, we didn't put safeguards in place when it came to value for money, but we had no leverage on price.
He finally says this in response to the question, and this is his paragraph 72, two paragraphs on from where we were just now. Did you consider a referrer vouching for or making representations on behalf of a supplier was relevant to the decision to progress a contract? And he says this: the referrer vouching for the supplier did not have any effect on my decision making about AO approval for contract, but may have played a part in the process of due diligence on the supplier as part of an overall assessment of risk or benefit. You wouldn't disagree with that either, would you?
No, again, my personal experience was that no personal pressure or anything was applied to me directly in regard to referrers. I put my assurance in the assurance process that came before it.
All right. That's very helpful. Thank you for that. Let's move on now then to information which you had to consider when making a decision. We've looked at the AO pack. You had a daily Excel spreadsheet, did you not? A PPE dashboard available to you?
Yep. So one of the features of a typical day, as far as I can describe it, was a 8:30 call and a 6:30 p.m. call, both of which included review of the latest demand signalling data from the PPE teams.
Is one of those the PMO update?
Correct.
That's the 6:30, is it? Yeah.
The 6:30 was named a pick list. So essentially the focus of that end of day call, which Treasury were invited to, was essentially to focus efforts on the most scarce resource, the most scarce PPE that needed to be prioritised for purchasing over the next 24 hours.
And you had a summary dashboard as well, did you not?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Did you feel that the information that was made available to you was overwhelming, was adequate, was convenient, could have been improved?
To sort of, there's quite a few questions there. So
it's a multiple choice.
So I think nobody was under any illusions that the data was perfect. Just I need to say that again, because whether data was sufficient, overwhelming, too much, the underlying data was not perfect, and nobody was under any illusions that that was anything but the case. Now, my involvement as an accounting officer was I received demand signalling data. I joined the end of day and start of day calls, but the point of that was to ensure that I had sufficient context to inform my decisions. I didn't, and deliberately so, get lost in overwhelming amounts of detail. There was a key metric that, as an accounting officer, we always focused on, and that was the number of days calculated before a specific PPE product stocked out, ran out, essentially. That was the key metric. Everyone was clear that that key metric was a calculation of various assumptions, all of which included variables that were very difficult to predict in the circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Young. In the relatively limited time remaining that we have this morning, Can I just take you to a few specific examples and see how this played out in practice? Could we start off with displaying INQ 000512 299? And here we have an email chain between yourself, HM Treasury and various finance and supply colleagues. And it says in summary, whilst we will not take a risk on issuing substandard PPE, this is the point you made a few moments ago,
Yep.
to frontline staff. So following the Treasury's condition on inspection here in the UK before issue, we need to take more risk on buying potentially substandard kit in order to secure it all. I would like us to adopt this immediately whilst we concurrently square off with HMT. Now, in relation to, what did you mean by that last phrase?
The last sentence about concurrently squaring off with HMT.
Yes, exactly.
So again, part of everything we did was to try and ensure that the Treasury came along with us rather than being kept on the outside. So again, one of the features of a typical day would be at least one call with the Treasury. They would, in their role, often on our behalf, have to seek Treasury ministerial approval for certain actions that were deemed novel or contentious or actually required additional spending budgets. So when John, David and myself agreed that we needed to slightly heighten our risk in regards to the feasibility of every deal, that would mean that within perhaps half an hour of sending this email, that a conversation would be held with the Treasury as part of the daily conversations to explain to them why that was necessary.
Is that what actually happened in this case?
What you can't see on what's on screen now is further down this email chain, the Treasury had already been pre-warned and were expecting this.
Okay, so it didn't come as a surprise to them?
It did not come as a surprise to them.
All right. And would you say in most cases where there were deviations from a spending envelope, say, the Treasury were involved in the decision-making process or any change in approach that was adopted?
They were, and it's really important to note, and I'd like to put on record that Treasury officials were fantastic through the period that we worked with them. Their availability in very challenging times to work with us and be seen to be part of what we were doing was very, very good. The daily conversations and many, many email exchanges over the course of what were very, very long days meant that in reality everything was being done collectively and collaboratively.
We've heard from some of them already at this inquiry. We heard from Mr. Steve Barclay, we heard from Lord Agnew. Both of those witnesses grew frustrated that they were given limited time to sanction significant increases in funding or in spending envelopes. Do you want to comment on that, that point that you may or may not have seen in previous evidence?
I can understand. In ordinary times, a Treasury Minister would take as much time as they deemed fit to take such decisions, and they would ordinarily ask for a number of assurances that would give them confidence that the organisation or the department concerned would be safeguarding the public purse. What I would say is that decisions such as what you've described, being taken at short notice, were often the point of a long and continuous conversation with the Treasury and their officials, and is entirely reflective of the pace and the nature at which things were moving in the pandemic. From the very early outset, we put in place an agreed budget with the Treasury, signed off by Treasury ministers, that very, very quickly became outdated. And I think as such is it characteristically Treasury ministers may have got the sense of being done to in terms of decisions and short notice. I think the Treasury and their officials were working with us to minimise the chances that be the case, but in some respects it was simply unavoidable due to the pace at which things were moving, and the way in which the data was evolving and the assumptions around whether it be the stock levels, the actual disease itself, all of which were evolving at significant pace.
Let's look at a small number of additional examples. Can we display INQ 000510725, please? This is the Cargo Services Far East offer that you may recall. I don't know if you do. And we have a section in this. This is the top sheet, or one of the top sheets of the AO pack, isn't it?
Correct, yep.
And do you see the part that starts the guide price for aprons is, and there are various parts that have been redacted out for reasons of sensitivity. The price is driven by the increase in demand across the globe for these products, and we're competing with other governments to secure stock. This is the case at the moment across all PPE. Although we can't see the actual figures, in this case there is a 900% price increase from the benchmark for the former, and a 400% price increase from the benchmark in the latter. Clearly, this is a case in which the 25% limit was very significantly exceeded, wasn't it?
Yes. I can't see the figures, so I'll trust you that those are is the case. If the question where you are leading to is what would have been the sort of the substance of an AO assessment based on this specific deal, it would be less likely to be approved given those high percentage increases above the benchmark, but it wouldn't automatically be a rejection, because I think what really importantly the AO would be looking at would be the specific product concerned and how many days until the NHS stocked out, and the availability of the specific products concerned. So it's all part of a rounded decision rather than one specific thing leading it to a formulaic yes-no decision.
That was the first half of my question. Yes, it wouldn't rule it out. It would be dependent on the immediate need at a given moment. But the second half was, to what extent, if any, were the Treasury involved in a decision such as this, where the pricing that was considered acceptable far exceeded that for which guidance was previously given?
So the Treasury, when their ministers approved an increase in budget to ensure that spending remained regular, they placed upon us a number of conditions that they expected to be met, one of which was to make best attempts to stay within a 25% tolerance level. So that was a guide, best attempts. It wasn't a cap. So therefore, where we did unavoidably exceed the 25% rolling benchmark, it did not mean that we had to go back to the Treasury for further approvals. I think that would have been inefficient, and probably it wouldn't be in keeping with the delegations that were provided to the accounting officers by the Treasury ministers.
Another issue that perhaps was addressed in less detail, given the circumstances, is due diligence. Do you recall having involvement in the P14 Medical Limited offer?
Not specifically, no.
OK, let's bring it up on the screen. INQ 000521630. Might help jog your memory. P14 Medical are registered in the UK. Their registration number is so and so forth. The company has an exemption from submitting full accounts. And then in a following document, INQ 000521641, we see this. This is a small business, according to its website. Apologies, I'm moving quite swiftly through these now. There is limited financial data available as they file abbreviated accounts and have only been in operation since 2017. And there are various concerns or caveats made. This is nonetheless an offer that received approval. Is it fair to say that in normal circumstances, more due diligence would have been conducted, or on the basis of the concerns that were raised about the offer, it was one that wouldn't have progressed.
I think that's a fair assumption. I don't think it's appropriate to compare what was happening at the time to non-pandemic activities, because in a non-pandemic environment, this sort of deal would have gone through weeks and weeks and weeks of due diligence. I think just to comment on the two different P14 deals you've shown on screen over the last minute, you can see in the second one there is additional detail, and I think what that would have been is proportionate to the size and value of the deal on screen versus the earlier one, which I think wasn't clear from what you showed, but I think was actually a lot lower value deal. So in the circumstances, the due diligence and the information provided to the accounting officer was proportionate, which is why there's more information here. And I think slightly off screen, which you can't see on right now, there is a little bit more information around the additional work in the red text on screen there. You can see the additional work that was undertaken to provide further assurance that some of those concerns hadn't been completely eliminated, but some work that was undertaken to minimise the risk.
So something was done, but perhaps not as much as would have ideally be done.
Absolutely. Was it sufficient for the accounting officer to take the decision? Yes. Was it perfect? No.
All right, one last topic by way of example through a concrete case, and then I just want to invite your reflections. It's fraud prevention. Could we have displayed INQ 000519-212? And then we'll need, so this introduces it, then we'll need to move on to 19213. But I think you can see there, we've also been asked that for new suppliers, in addition, is that page 2, I think it is, of this, there we are. There it is, the third bullet point. We've also been asked that for new suppliers, in addition to a completed supplier form, supplier's bank account details are provided on supplier letterhead paper. And then if we go to display INQ 000519-213, we'll see what was provided. And there it is, bank account details on a letterhead. On the face of it, it doesn't look particularly compelling as a method of avoiding fraud. Do you take a different view about what was provided in this case?
I think what you're looking at on screen is a part of a standard suite of financial control checks that you would have in any scenario, whether that be pandemic or non-pandemic. But B, it's in isolation. So I think some of the correspondence in the previous exhibit showed that there was immediate follow-up to check that certain things were as you would expect. So ordinarily, there is a validation of information that's provided, such as this on screen. So I think we're looking at one thing in terms of a number of things that go into validating and checking a new supplier that hadn't already been used.
All right. Mr. Young, you provide your reflections towards the end of your written evidence. You say this at paragraph 80, finally, I feel that despite the best attempts of all civil servants to find common ground, the risk appetite for procurement of PPE at the Treasury, of Treasury ministers, was not always aligned with that of the Prime Minister and the DHSC. Now, the evidence that you've given this morning was to the effect that there was close liaison and agreement between them, whereas at your paragraph 80, you're effectively telling us that they didn't always see eye to eye. Which was it? And if it was the latter, was that a problem?
So let me make the distinction between the close collaborative work with Treasury officials, which, as I've said earlier, they were very much part of things as they evolved. And the comment made in my statement, I should clarify that I have a deep admiration for all of the work done from Treasury officials and Treasury ministers during the period. The specific point I was making in my statement was that upon agreeing a increased budget and making it very, very clear that Treasury ministers were providing the delegation to accounting officers and the parameters in which they expected those decisions to be taken, there were, in addition, a number of other conditions that were provided that seemed not wholly aligned to those delegations, specifically seeking levels and volumes of information at a frequency that at that point in time didn't fully exist, which was known to the Treasury officials at the time. And actually that condition, in my opinion, whilst understandable at face value, actually risked distracting certain people who were working in the PPE team from actually getting on and sourcing and assuring deals when they were being asked to provide a huge volume of data to the Treasury at a frequency that was not wholly aligned to the delegations that the Treasury had provided for us to work within. So delegating us a budget, delegating us approval rights, and agreeing parameters in which to work within was all great and fine, but there was just some certain conditions that therefore just felt misaligned to those delegations and misaligned to the overall risk appetite that was set by the Prime Minister and agreed with the Health Secretary at the time.
So, Mr. Young, final question for you from me. Whether it relate to that or any other matter, which practical steps would you recommend in order to make the processes in which you were involved function better in the event of a future pandemic?
If the question is not what could we have done better, but actually what could we do better in hindsight.
Let's focus on the future.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would say that having much more mature live data in respect of stock inventory would have been enormously helpful and made the real challenges as an accounting officer that I've described and you have asked me about not specifically easier, but the decisions would have been backed with even better information.
All right, Mr. Young, those are all my questions for you. My lady, I know that there are some questions from two of the CPs.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Wald. Ms Mitchell, I think you're going first.
I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. I'd like to ask you first about a comment that you make in relation to your recommendations. At paragraph 80 of your statement, you say, in my opinion, there ought to be proper consideration going forward as to whether there's a place for prioritising known suppliers or those suppliers referred to by trusted scenarios. Now, what I want to know is, first of all, what did you mean by trusted scenarios? Are those trusted sources?
I think what I meant with that statement is I think this inquiry has seen some of the data around the number of offers received, many of which were well intended. So 50,000 offers from over 15,000 suppliers. How the triaging happens on that volume of information in the most effective way, I think is something that we certainly should be thinking about looking at it for a future pandemic. And not to go into any sort of suggestion of preferential treatment, but thinking about where there are more trusted suppliers. So as an accounting officer, one of the things I would have looked at in any deal, for example, is whether a supplier is an existing supplier to the NHS, which would increase my confidence in the feasibility of such a deal, rather than an unknown supplier, whether it be to the Department of Health or actually new to the market. So finding a way of increasing confidence in the actual feasibility of a deal, particularly in the context of the volume of deals and volumes of offers, is something that I do think is worth thinking about going forward.
And so the trusted scenarios, were those the trusted sources? Are we talking there about the priority lane?
I wasn't specifically referencing the priority lane. I think what I was suggesting is, given some of the challenges that an accounting officer faced in really trying to understand and gain confidence in the feasibility of a deal, the more that can be done to increase confidence in that feasibility, the better, whether that's an existing NHS supplier or a UK supplier or other sources. Essentially, we're just looking for that increased confidence.
So who were the trusted suppliers, trusted scenarios that you were referring to in your statement, paragraph 80?
I guess the trusted scenarios would be those suppliers that were known to us.
Or those suppliers referred by trusted scenarios?
Trusted scenarios. So we had a system where we couldn't scale the existing NHS sourcing arrangements, but those arrangements are in place because they bring in trusted sources and trusted contracts. NHS procurement activity takes place using existing frameworks where trusted suppliers that have been through effective due diligence are placed. So this essentially, the comment is around how you increase your confidence and your trust that a deal will be as feasible as you hope it will be.
And we heard part of the idea about increasing confidence is to minimise risk, particularly in a seller's market. Could you perhaps give us any idea, if you've thought of any, or how you might minimise or guard against the possibility of corruption in respect of what you describe as trusted scenarios?
Well, I think if we're thinking about individuals who were brought in to work within the process itself, i.e. the process of the process of sourcing contracts and sourcing suppliers, those individuals will have gone through a process of declarations of interest and registering conflicts of interest. So in my experience and my personal involvement, which came at the end of a process,
Indeed.
I had to place my assurance that those sorts of conflicts of interest had been dealt with earlier in the process by those involved.
Okay, thank you. And very briefly, you state that you didn't give preferential treatment to deals emanating for the HPL, the high priority lane. Were you ever asked to give updates to anyone or liaise with anyone who had made an offer through this lane?
Personally, no. My point at the end of the 8-stage process, as I've said earlier, safeguarded a degree of independence. My review of deals were based on the facts in front of me, the scarcity of the product and the overall risk appetite. I never had any personal engagement with any referrer in any shape or form. And I must say this, and I mean this completely authentic. The whole HPL thing has come as quite a big surprise to me years later, because everything that was done, that I did personally was with clean, honest intent. And I do feel it's put a stain on a lot of hard work that was undertaken during the process to try and do the right thing and save lives and make sure we had enough PPE. So it has come as a real personal surprise to me years later. Not that people made profits, to my earlier comment, but that there was some obviously some sinister work that I know is being looked at through other avenues.
Milady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. Mr Dale, I think you've got a couple of questions.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Young, I ask questions on behalf of the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organizations, or FEMO, and I have two very short topics. Firstly, were PPE procurement decisions expressly reviewed for their compliance with the public sector equality duty?
That was not something that I had personal consideration of in my assessments at the end of the process. What I would say is that my assumption would be that would be considered in the same way in which any other legal or statutory requirement would have been considered in the earlier stages of assurance. And had there been any specific issues in regards to that topic, in the same way in which other matters would have been brought to my attention by exception, I would have expected that to be the same. I cannot personally recall any example where that was the case.
Okay. Can I ask for your assistance with this? How was impact on ethnic minority healthcare workers considered in the context of contract assessment?
Personally, it wasn't when it came to my specific role. Again, I can't speak for assurances and considerations that were taken earlier in the process. All I can say is that had there been any specific concerns on that matter, it should have been related as part of the overall assessment and recommendation of a deal. So it was something that the accounting officer would and could take into consideration. But again, I cannot personally recall that ever being raised as an item of exception.
And second topic, and perhaps at the risk of going over territory that you might have covered, did equality considerations, the matter of ill-fitting PPE, for example, factor into your financial assessments and procurement specifications?
The risk of unsuitable PPE being purchased was part of the consideration when I talked earlier about one of the 4 managing public money criteria, feasibility. So it was a real risk and very challenging when operating with international suppliers to know with certainty that the PPE you would be buying would be as intended and exactly as per the technical specification, which is why that when it came to assessing the deals and approving the deals, we had to go with some risk when it came to that specific point, but in the knowledge that the equipment would all be inspected, clinically inspected upon arrival into the UK, and no substandard PPE should therefore have been distributed into the system, which would have included ill-fitting PPE, because ill-fitting, I guess, is a rather general term. I would say if it didn't meet the technical specifications that were expected of that specific product.
Very well. Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dale. I'm very grateful. Mr. Young, that completes the questions that we have for you. You're not the first witness, and I suspect you're not the last. I think we've got at least one more who feels that huge amount of effort that you and your colleagues put into obtaining supplies of PPE to save lives has been undermined by certain aspects of the procurement process. And I'm genuinely sorry that people who worked as hard as you did and your colleagues did should have been put under that kind of scrutiny when it wasn't fair. So I hope you understand why we're looking at it. And we imply no criticism of you or most of your colleagues by doing so. So thank you very much indeed for what you did, and thank you for the help you've given to the inquiry.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well. I shall be extraordinarily generous and give you an extra 3 minutes break. I shall return at 11:30.
Thank you, my lady.
Hello, Mr. Hardy.
My lady, our next witness is Andrew Slade. Please can he be sworn or affirmed?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Please can you state your full name for the record?
Andrew Keith Rideout Slade.
Thank you. Now, you have provided the inquiry with a witness statement dated the 30th of September 2024, and it is INQ 000506956. Can I ask you to confirm, please, is that witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you. turning by way of introduction to your professional background, you joined Welsh Government in 2012, is that correct?
That's correct.
And in January 2018, you became the Director General of Economy, Skills and Natural Resources, is that right?
That's also correct.
And you led Economy, Skills and Natural Resources until April 2022.
Yes.
And so you were in that role during the course of the pandemic?
Yes, and in subsequent roles in a different configuration, but yes, for that period.
You then became Director General, Economy, Treasury and Constitution. And in following March 2024, you became Director General, Economy, Energy and Transport.
That's right.
You've also held a number of senior roles outside of Wales in the public sector. Is that a fair summary?
It is fair, yes.
Thank you. You address in your witness statement very helpfully the role of the Commercial and Procurement Directorate. Now, to be clear, the Commercial and Procurement Directorate, which we'll refer to as CPD for speed if that's all right, develops procurement policy for the Welsh Government and the public sector in Wales. Is it right that it is also sometimes referred to as the National Procurement Service?
That is right in respect of its outward-facing role within the wider Welsh public sector, and that's a brand that to some extent we continue to use for those functions, support and guidance for the wider public sector. So
where the phrase National Procurement Service or NPS is found in exhibits to your statement, that is a reference to the CPD?
It is.
CPD sat within Economy, Skills and Natural Resources Group, and so it came within the remit of the group of which you were Director General.
Yes.
And it itself was led by Dean Bedcroft, is that
He
right?
was the acting director, that's correct.
Now, CPD has both a policy role and an oversight role in relation to government procurement. In practical terms, what does CPD do?
So looking out into the public sector at large, it provides guidance, helps with interpretation of the regulatory framework, training, develops capability and capacity, and manages and leads a number of category-wide procurement frameworks from which public sector and voluntary sector bodies can go ahead and buy services and goods. And then internally, facing into the Welsh Government, it provides advice and support to all of Welsh Government's buying activities, and it has a certain number of control roles as well in respect of any attempt to make a departure from the rules. CPD will be involved in signing those off.
You mentioned there having a control role. Does the CPD ensure that contracting authorities comply with their obligations under the PCR, historically under the PCR?
Yes, to a degree. Obviously, each organisation that is buying must affirm, be clear that it's meeting the rules and stand for those themselves. But CPD has a coordinating and oversight role and provides advice on regulation.
The inquiry has already heard that in relation to procurement of PPE, NWSSP was the relevant contracting authority during the pandemic. Is it right that the CPD worked closely with NWSSP?
It is right, yes.
Audit Wales have reported that the NWSSP did not comply with its obligations under the procurement contracts regulations to publish contract award notices within the 30-day deadline. And before I go on to ask you a question about that, can I ask that we have on screen, please, INQ 000214235 at page 45. And there we are. This is an extract from that report. At paragraph 2.30, Audit Wales say they had looked at 9 samples Of the 9 full contract award notices published in our sample, none were published within 30 days of awarding the contract. On reviewing them, we found several had incorrect dates for the date the contract was awarded. Shared Services is rectifying these errors, and it goes on to explain that some VEATs were published within the 30-day deadline, but that wasn't strictly a requirement. There's an explanation there, which is that obviously staff were under an awful lot of pressure at the time, and we've heard about that pressure in a UK and Scottish context already. Thank you. We can have that off the screen now. When you talk about a sort of control role or an oversight role, was CPD aware that that 30-day deadline wasn't being met by NWSSP?
I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did, mainly because the focus was on ensuring that Ministerial was procured effectively and quickly, and I think some of the record keeping and the publications came later, as is slightly indicated in that comment. I think from memory, the Auditor General goes on to say that in investigating each of those cases, there wasn't anything wrong with the procurement. It was simply a delay in getting the material published. And just to clarify, the role of CPD in control terms is in relation to aspects of Welsh Government's internal procurement in that sense.
So you don't see the role of CPD as extending to bodies such as NWSSP complying with their obligations in procurement law, assisting them with that, holding them accountable to that?
Assisting, yes, and providing guidance and advice and working with UK government and other relevant parties, but not there as an enforcer. There were different control arrangements for the NHS through another part of Welsh Government.
And in hindsight, do you think perhaps CPD should have that role where it liaises closely with the body that has a significant budget?
Liaison is very close. The teams work very closely together. They would have a very strong shared understanding of the rules, and I'm sure Shared Services Partnership colleagues will be involved in helping shape Welsh Government policy because they've got so much to contribute. But I don't think there's a sort of formal control role for CPD, and I think that would be tricky to arrange because of the way that the Welsh Government is organised and our various other bodies around Wales that undertake these types of roles.
And just briefly on this point before we move on to another topic, you were keen to point out there that you didn't think there was necessarily anything wrong with the contracts themselves, but the principle of publishing a contract award notice under the previous regulations was to allow members of the public to see how taxpayer money is being spent. Would you agree that the principle of publication honours transparency, honours accountability?
Yes, and it's certainly a lesson that I think we have learned for the future. But I think in the context of the heat of the pandemic, the focus of effort was elsewhere.
And would you further agree that if there isn't proper transparency, there is a risk of loss of public confidence in the way that governments spend taxpayer money?
Yes, transparency assists generally in that regard.
All right. I'm going to ask you about the procurement activities that CPD carried out. I'll say at the outset, we know they were very limited. We've mentioned previously that NWSSP was the contracting authority that sourced the majority of the PPE used in the health and social care system. But the CPD was involved in the procurement of PPE outside of health and social care settings. Can you explain very briefly how that was done?
CPD colleagues liaise very closely with the Welsh Local Government Association and with procurement functions out in local authorities, and had a strong, long-standing relationship there, and that came in good stead during the pandemic. One of the things that they would have been working on in the early phases of the pandemic would have been with local government on supply to the care sector, and as that went on, I think they continued to work with local government on supply for domiciliary settings, domestic care, as distinct from in a care home or in another health and social care setting. They were also very closely involved in helping other bits of the public sector with their own PPE demands, particularly as the pandemic went on and as rules developed around what should be being used in different settings. So I'm thinking there of schools, public transport, those sorts of things.
Thank you. There was also a framework agreement in relation to FFP2 disposable masks. You explain at paragraph 118 of your statement that this framework agreement was made available to NWSSP, and they made call-offs from that for the purchase of FFP2 masks for the use in health and social care settings. Is that right?
I think so, I understand. So the two frameworks that are relevant that were being managed by CPD related to PPE and workwear in one respect, and in relation to cleaning materials in another. And I think that that was available to colleagues in the SSP, the Shared Services Partnership, as indeed would all of the frameworks have been, to draw down from, whether that was through direct awards or through mini competitions. In reality, I think much of what was bought was through direct awards and through more emergency-related procurement routes.
Thank you. Moving on then to procurement policy in Wales. We've already heard from previous witnesses about the procurement policy notes that were issued by the Cabinet Office during the pandemic. You tell us at paragraph 86 of your statement that during the pandemic, all 4 UK home nations tried to adopt a consistent approach to the many procurement challenges that arose, and that officials from the CPD and other devolved governments worked with the UK Cabinet Office to develop the 4 procurement policy notes. So the issuing of these procurement policy notes, it was coordinated, it was agreed, it didn't come to a surprise as to Welsh Government?
No, I think this would be an example of where we would say we had co-designed those policy notes with colleagues across the rest of the United Kingdom, and I think there were weekly calls with the Cabinet Office and other devolved governments as part of that, along with regular, possibly monthly calls with the Crown Commercial Services team.
Thank you. And those following the inquiry will be familiar with them, but we had PPN 0120 published in March 2020, which was really the first PPN which signalled that the use of direct awards would be acceptable during the pandemic. It was followed by PPN 0220, 0320, and then 0420, which was published in June 2020, and it dealt with recovery and transition from COVID-19. Just briefly, that final PPN, it wasn't adopted as is, word for word, but it was amended so that it made sense in the Welsh context. Is that a fair description? Substantially
identical, but references tweaked to make sure that they made sense in the Welsh context.
And in terms of the law, the framework, you say in your witness statement at paragraph 94 that the legal and regulatory framework in place during the pandemic didn't pose any specific problems or challenges for the CPD or bodies it was assisting. Is that correct, to the best of your understanding? It is. They were established rules. We were familiar with them. The rest of the public sector was familiar with them, and they had enough components within them to allow for deployment in an emergency situation, like, as you say, direct awards, single tender actions, and so on. I'd want to focus with you now on, I suppose, what was different in the Welsh procurement policy landscape as compared to the UK centrally. There are particular pieces of legislation. I'm thinking of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Yes. And the, not legislation, but the procurement policy statement of 2012, which was then followed by the procurement policy statement of 2021. You address these in your witness statement in detail. Before I go on, were the principles encompassed by these applicable during the emergency, during the pandemic? Yes, they were, but the pressing needs of the emergency were the top thing that mattered. So we had used procurement policy as a tool to try and embed
greater sustainability in supply chains in relation to carbon reduction, in relation to ethical employment in supply chains, in relation to driving community benefits, and that continued to be important. But I would say that it was much more important to make sure that the right PPE in this context was arriving where it needed to be at the right time, and that was the overriding factor at stake.
And we've heard, for example, that the majority of PPE was imported and the majority of PPE was disposable. So perhaps that first principle you...
Is tricky, yes.
Indeed.
And we did look at the possibility of reusable material, but that also remained tricky through the pandemic in terms of cleansing and disinfection, and simply having something that was usable and fit for purpose.
And we'll come to attempts to innovate with later witnesses today. The procurement policy statement of 2021 also emphasises collaboration. It talks about integrating procurement into the heart of Welsh policy development and supporting the Welsh Government's policy objective relating to progressive procurement such as the foundational and circular economy through collaborative place-based procurement activity which nurtures resilient local supply chains. That's a long sentence, but can I ask you, was this in part drawn from the experience of supply chain disruption during the pandemic?
It was informed by that, yes, in that later statement.
And that reference to nurturing resilient local supply chains, what does that mean in practical terms? What are the expectations of Welsh contracting authorities, and in particular NWSSP, in relation to that?
In non-emergency times, the hope is that you will be working with partners to build supply chains, in this context in Wales, that you'll be working with companies, small to medium-sized enterprises, to make it easier for them to pitch for government contracts. I mean, around a third, just under, of public spending in Wales comes through procurement of goods and services by the public sector. So it's an important area of spend. Those things continue to be important through the pandemic and were particularly important in the context of trying to ginger up local supply. And as you mentioned, you'll want to come on to that later today. But the main focus there was on, through the pandemic itself, getting hold of supplies and making sure that those were effectively distributed.
There is now also the Social Partnership and Procurement Act 2023, and there is also, we know, new legislation that only came into force very early this year. In terms of procurement policy for Wales and lessons learned from procurement during the pandemic, what, in your view, are the key lessons as applicable to emergency procurement?
That you need to be, back to your point about transparency, you need to be transparent about how you are using the rules, that you are very clear up front about what you are trying to do, that you make sure that you've got proper records that can be come back over at a later stage so that you're ensuring compliance. I think that's a key lesson learned and point to take forward. And then slightly straying into the how do you get domestic supply up and running? What can you do with supply chains through public procurement policy to put them in a stronger place, either for responding to an emergency or indeed to build indigenous supply in anticipation of such things happening? That's a bit more complicated because I think, as my colleague Alan Brace said recently, resilience brings with it costs, but that's part of the thinking for the future through the change policy. And the Welsh Act, the Social Partnership Act, enshrines in law for public bodies in Wales a number of the principles that were being operated prior to the pandemic. And I think it's fair to say, although I'm not an expert and I no longer look after the procurement function, that the most recent changes at the UK level are all about increased transparency and increased flexibility in procurement arrangements.
You've referred there to the creation of indigenous supply chains as being part of the thinking for the future. Are you aware of any concrete steps that have been taken to ensure that there is diversification of supply chains ahead of a pandemic striking?
My understanding of, I'm not directly answerable for these areas now. A lot of work went on through PPE preparedness. There was, I mean, initially in the pandemic, there was the work on the winter plan, but we went on to have a more strategic approach to procurement of PPE led by colleagues in the Health and Social Services Group and by the Shared Services Partnership. And I believe that those lessons have been absorbed and woven into how we operate collectively. And then in relation to supply chains, we now have established mechanisms for getting ready at pace to stand up local domestic supply. That's slightly different from that slightly trickier question about what do you do for the longer run in terms of indigenous supply, where you might be wanting to create stores and stocks of material domestically, and that comes at a cost, and it's also very unlikely that UK manufacturers are going to be the cheapest manufacturers across the world, so that has to be borne in mind.
Thank you. You alluded a few moments ago to the fact that the majority of PP procurement took place by way of direct awards or emergency procurement. Almost by definition, emergency procurement doesn't take place very often, and so it's not something that even seasoned procurement professionals have a great deal of experience of. They may do now. Do you think the CPD should have had in place guidance to disseminate to contracting authorities, specifically addressing how to go about emergency procurement and direct awards of contracts?
I think there was some advice and guidance already out there, but as you say, it might not have been tested, and it might have been based on theory rather than practice. The only thing I would say to that is that we worked very closely with the UK government on that first procurement advice note in March of 2020. That was a joint effort across the UK to get advice out to public sector contracting authorities on making use of emergency provisions within the regulatory framework.
CPD did produce something called the Buyer's Guide for PPE during the pandemic. And I wonder if we could have up on screen, please, INQ 000198576. Thank you. There it is on the screen. And this Buyer's Guide was developed with the support of the British Safety Industry Federation.
Yes.
And it was aimed at assisting procurement teams across the public sector in identifying non-compliant PPE, and it provides a handy list of products approved for sale in the UK. Page 1, it sets out that there has been a huge influx of offers to supply PPE to the Welsh public sector, and critical items such as face masks and gloves fall into various classes and categories, and the inquiry has heard about the differing responsibilities of those regulating medical devices and personal protective equipment already. What led to the development of this Buyer's Guide?
A general view, I think, within the procurement community that a lot of smaller public bodies and voluntary sector organisations were getting inundated, as the text suggests there, with offers of product. We already knew through the work that we were doing through central government and through colleagues' work in the Shared Services Partnership just how much was out there in terms of substandard PPE. I don't think this Buyer's Guide was particularly aimed at large public sector bodies or indeed ourselves. It was more for other people out there in the public and voluntary and community sectors to give them some help in understanding what sort of standards they should be looking for when they were buying PPE.
It was also provided to Seret, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
And we see there in the last line, NPS, so that is CPD, are currently seeing a huge amount of suspect PP documentation from a wide variety of sources. So again, was that something that had come to your attention through intelligence sharing, through your liaison with the industry?
Yes, through liaison with the industry, liaison with local government, liaison with other contracting parties across Wales. MPS/CPD would have regular meetings with other buyers across Wales, and would be putting out newsletters and guidance on a regular basis. So all of that intelligence, the two-way process, would have been fed in here. I think in this case, in relation to suspect PPE documentation, we found lots of things with sort of screen grabs and other, visually alarming changes to documentation coming in, bad grammar, a whole range of things of that sort, incorrect references, things like that.
Can we turn to page 6 of this document, please? It addresses the issue of fake certificates. Is that... There we are. We have it on the screen now, heading counterfeit products. So the guide provides some examples of what to look out for and some visual examples and so on.
Yes.
Now, it's a very short guide. It runs to only 7 pages. You've referenced at page 1, or the author references at page 1, that guidance can't all be easily accessed in one place. Was this short, handy guide for buyers needed, in part because the regulatory landscape was very complicated?
I think it was probably needed for a range of reasons, partly that, as you describe, partly just because of the pace at which things were happening, but also medical guidance on what we should be doing through the pandemic was changing as well through this period. So a lot of queries and questions were being raised, and a lot of parties out in the market were trying to exploit that general sense of things moving, developing, turbulence in the system, and I think that was part of it.
This guide, or this version, is dated June 2020. Is this the earliest version as far as you're aware?
I had thought that we had produced something in May, but I may have misremembered that.
All right. The question in any event is the same, which is, should a guide like this be put in place by the CPD or any other public authority as part of pandemic preparations in the
Yes,
future?
ideally, yes.
CPD also held formal seminars and training sessions for procurement staff, and also worked alongside the Life Sciences Hub, which we'll come to later today in more detail. But essentially, Life Sciences Hub had a role in triaging offers of supply of PPE to NWSSP. Is it right that, in fact, some CPD staff were integrated into the Life Sciences team to assist them?
Yes.
And so there wasn't simply an advisory role. Staff were redeployed to swell the ranks, essentially.
Yes, either directly or virtually, but to make sure that, as you say, the ranks were swollen to meet demand, and also to share and develop learning and expertise on what was available and what shouldn't be being bought.
So would it be fair to say that the CPD took on a role that was, in fact, beyond its original remit and adapted during the pandemic? And brought together not only procurement experience, but also developed experience in, as we've seen from the buyer's guide, certification, PPE-specific intelligence on product specifications, on attempts at fraudulent certification, regulatory requirements and so on.
Yes, all those things.
And are there plans, to the best of your knowledge, to stand up this kind of work again in the event of a future pandemic?
I think so. It forms part of our arrangements, and it would certainly be one of my recommendations to the inquiry in terms of responding in future.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you now about mutual aid and cooperation between the 4 nations. You've explained in simple terms how consequential funding works in your statement, and you've referred to the Barnett formula. Wales received a total of £1.022 billion in consequential funding from the UK government in relation to PPE. Is that right?
That's correct.
And does that encompass all PPE, or is that restricted to the NWSSP spend?
I can't remember in relation to the money that came in as consequential funding. The money that I know we spent was reported through the Shared Services Partnership, so it was getting close to 400 million, I think 385 million reported by the Shared Services Partnership as having been spent by the NHS in Wales on PPE out of that pot of money that had come from the UK government.
Right. You also addressed in your statement the pandemic stock principles, which were agreed between the four nations, and you also set out a little bit about how mutual aid between the nations worked. Wales made good use of mutual aid arrangements, didn't it?
It did. We were sort of supported in doing so by ministers, but as again, I think my former colleague Alan Brace set out in his evidence, we were net exporters through mutual aid in the event to other parts of the United Kingdom, particularly England and Northern Ireland. We also received supplies from Scotland and Northern Ireland and also from the UK arrangements as part of that.
And mutual aid also extended to the loan of 20 million tests to England. So the arrangement there was that Wales effectively transferred 20 million tests to England and England then replenished that stock.
That's my understanding,
Is that what's
yes.
meant by loan?
Yes.
And do you see that as playing mutual aid, as seeing a key role in ensuring that Wales has sufficient PPE in the event of a future pandemic?
Yes, as a government, we concluded, ministers were very clear about this from, I think, about April of 2020 onwards, that we ought to have a three-pronged approach to this. We should get on and source our own supply, and that was done through the Shared Services Partnership. We should participate in mutual aid arrangements and support other parts of the UK as they supported us, and that we should look to stimulate domestic supply of things that were in short supply or areas where we thought there might be, innovations needed to assist the health and social care services.
Welsh Government made a number of attempts to stimulate domestic manufacturing. We've touched upon this already, but on the 3rd of April 2020, the First Minister issued a call to action for Welsh businesses to create a new Welsh supply chain of PPE. And that was then echoed by Ken Skates. The critical engineering requirement team was set up, CERET was set up to assist with that, and we will hear from them later on. But I just want to come back to something you say in your statement, is that the effectiveness of steps to stimulate domestic production wasn't formally measured. Is this something perhaps Welsh Government or CPD should have been monitoring during the pandemic?
I think so. It's a little bit like the point you made earlier about coming back to make sure that things are properly published and timescales are met. There are components of what we did where it would have been better, preferable to have kept more records or have more information available. I am sure, knowing how hard colleagues worked across the procurement professions and in CERET and elsewhere, that this would have been about sheer pace of work, the volume of things coming in, and a focus on making sure that offers were triaged, that work was followed up and fed into the system to supply PPE. But yes, I think for the future, having better oversight of what was happening and keeping better records of how things were taken up and what supply was arranged and available through manufacturing supply chains, that it would be preferable to have that information.
Notwithstanding that lack of information, can we just look at paragraph 238 of your witness statement? There it is. You tell us that over 30 companies repurposed production lines to produce hand sanitizer, 25 repurposed production lines to make face visors, 30 companies provided decontamination solutions, and so on. You say Welsh Government estimates in total 400 jobs were created because of this commercial activity, and volunteers made over 5,000 sets of scrubs. Thank you. Can we have up also INQ 000470704, page 2? This is these are bullet points sketched out for a public statement to be made by the First Minister. And we see there the fourth bullet point from the bottom explains that there's work being done to secure new supply chains. There are examples there being given, and that Wales has become self-sufficient in scrubs. We can have that down off the screen now. Thank you. Wales didn't need to, from that point on, import any more scrubs for use in the health and social care sector.
I don't know whether that's the case. At the time, significant numbers were being produced. Whether that continued to be the case throughout the rest of the pandemic, I don't know.
So this might be a snapshot in time. You're not
Yes.
able to say.
Yes.
Thank you. Can we have up on screen, please, INQ 000472023 on page 3. This is a PP Lessons Learned presentation dated the 22nd of January 2021. We see there some lessons learned, including supply issues experienced, which we've heard about. Engaging and onboarding Welsh manufacturers took time and effort. Welsh PP market may not be sustainable or competitive on cost. The report authors there take the view that it may simply not be sustainable to rely on Welsh manufacture of PP. We've discussed this a little in your evidence already. In light of that, do you think there might be difficulties in implementing the policies you've referred to earlier in your evidence?
Not in the sense that they can be supplemental and they can help with provision and supply of this type of material, but it won't be a solution in and of itself. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very unlikely that UK manufacturing is going to be the cheapest source of a manufactured good in many cases compared with what's available through international markets. So we have to be realistic about that. And I think my recommendation, to the inquiry, back to the point I was making earlier, is have arrangements that you can stand up quickly that will be effective, and where people understand broadly what's going to happen, because that will get things moving quicker. But that's not the same as saying we'll have everything produced domestically to meet the needs of a future pandemic.
In terms of pandemic preparedness, we've heard a great deal about the PIP stockpile. We've heard about pandemic preparedness exercises. On reflection, do you think perhaps procurement had been siloed off and considered as a separate topic area to pandemic preparedness generally?
I don't know for sure. I think it's fair to say that procurement colleagues had not been directly involved in pandemic preparations, but then colleagues from the Shared Services Partnership may well have been, so I'm not cited on that component. Procurement colleagues were certainly involved in some of the work we did around no-deal Brexit preparations and the purchasing components associated with that and impacts on supply chains. But I think there is an argument for greater involvement of procurement in contingency preparedness. Thinking back to other issues that I've been involved with over my career, we've certainly had procurement specialists involved in things like animal health and welfare crises, or in situations where we were dealing with flooding problems and aftermath of flood clear-up, where again having procurement professionals involved has been helpful.
The CPD was drafted in to assist Life Sciences Hub Wales, who in turn were drafted in to help NWSSP.
Yes.
It's a great deal of collaboration that we'll hear about throughout the course of today. Is there enough investment in procurement professionals in Wales? Is that something that needs to be scaled up ahead of time before an emergency such as a pandemic comes along?
I think there are 2 points there. One, I think the public sector generally needs more experts in procurement and supply chain management and in contract management. That would apply in, for want of a better term, peacetime as much as in an emergency situation. But yes, in terms of being ready for major situations of the sort that we're discussing here today, having more of that expertise available would be important.
Thank you for answering my questions. If you'll wait there, there'll be questions from other people. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms Morris, I think you're next.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr Slade. I ask questions on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. Just 2 topics, please. The first, you say in your statement that contracts that exceeded payments that exceeded 25% of a contract value had to go through approval by the Welsh Government. So my questions are, why was it set at that value, first of all, and did it cause any delays to the processing of those contracts?
I'm not sure I know the background to the why the threshold was set, whether it's prescribed in law or whether that was to do with our own procedures. This would all have been in relation to the work of the Shared Services Partnership, where we had pretty clear control mechanisms both for the actions of the Shared Services Partnership themselves, but also where, as you've pointed out, various things had to come into Welsh Government for some form of counter-signature. My understanding is, although I wasn't responsible for those areas, that there were summary processes used to make sure that those kinds of checks weren't a hold-up beyond what was needed to make sure that what we were proposing or what Shared Services colleagues were proposing to do was a sensible thing to do.
So they still happened?
They still happened.
But in a more expedited way?
Yes, indeed.
Is that correct? Okay, thank you. Second topic, please. The Welsh Government Head of Counter-Fraud prepared an audit and risk assessment committee prepared a report in January 2022. I think you've been shown that document by the inquiry before giving evidence this morning. Under its heading of potential lessons, it highlights that the CFAS National Fraud Database was only used in 10% of post-awards and claims in bulk upload. So just so I can maybe set some context with you, if that's okay. The National Fraud Database, is that a database of individuals to identify any fraud prior to awarding a contract in business as usual times?
Yes, and we would use it, although clearly, as that report made out, not as extensively as maybe we could in relation to pre-approvals, but also checks afterwards before monies were paid out.
I see.
I think this report from our colleague at the head of the counter-fraud unit was largely aimed at work we were doing on grants to businesses in relation to economic support rather than in relation to procurement of PPE.
Okay. But the purpose of it then is a fraud prevention tool, is that fair to say?
Yes.
And the observation that is made by the committee is that if it's used post-award, you've missed an opportunity there to identify.
And it slows things down as well.
And it slows things down.
Yes.
And if you use it post-award, the only remedy you've then got to try and get the money back as opposed to influencing the decision that you're making about whether to give the award or not.
That's correct. I mean, generally we use a lot of business intelligence tools and a number of other credit safe type checks to get a very quick handle on who we're dealing with out in the private sector. But that is a different and additional mechanism. As I say, in this context, I think my colleague was referring to grants to business through our economic support through the pandemic.
So just help me then finally, please. Was it used then for the PPE award contracts pre-award?
I don't know,
Cool.
because that would be, in this context, a matter for colleagues in the Shared Services Partnership.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Those are my questions. Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Morris. Very grateful. Ms Parsons, I think you're up next.
Thank you, my lady. Can you hear me, Mr Slade?
I can. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. I want to ask you first, please, about supplies of PPE to frontline healthcare workers in Wales. We have been repeatedly told by the Welsh Government that Wales never ran out of PPE at a national level. And at paragraph 263 of your statement, you quote Vaughan Gething's evidence to the Senate's Health and Social Care Committee that there was enough PPE in the system, and that was in evidence on the 30th of April 2020. In that same month, Mr. Slade, April 2020, the Royal College of Nursing carried out a survey among nurses in Wales. Well, we don't need to turn it up, but for the inquiry's reference, it is INQ 000 214 235, page 29. I'll just summarise the results, if I may, before turning to the question. So the Royal College of Nursing results are found as follows. Only 46% of respondents said they had sufficient supplies of fluid-resistant masks. Only 52% had sufficient supplies of eye protection. Only 57% had sufficient supplies of gowns. And only 63% had sufficient supplies of FFP3 masks. So really significant shortages. How do you, Mr. Slade, reconcile Mr. Gething's narrative on one hand with the experience of the nursing community in Wales on the other?
I think probably both things can be true. You can have enough PPE stocks in circulation at the national level, and yet there can be problems at the local level in terms of distribution and supply. One of the reasons, I recall a discussion in our executive committee in Welsh Government in April, one of the reasons that colleagues on the health and social services side brought in the military to do assessment work was to look at what was happening at the local level, what was happening with local health boards and what was happening with local government colleagues as well in terms of distribution. So there are definitely lessons that we can learn about what happens at the local level, but I think it can also be true that what was circulating at the national level was sufficient for needs across the nation as a whole.
Well, before moving on, what were those problems that you refer to there in distribution and supply at a local level?
I think, from memory, often around provision of information about what was needed where and what stocks were held at a local level. So, I think my colleague Alan Brace mentioned some situations where there just was a lack of understanding at the local level of what was available locally. I think that was probably in the care context. But what can you do to increase flows of information and intelligence at the local level to try and address those issues at that level rather than necessarily what's happening at the national level?
We've been speaking about the early stages of the pandemic. What about later on, Mr. Slade? The British Medical Association conducted a survey of doctors in Wales in February 2021, so we're a year on, and only 37% of respondents had adequate supplies of PPE for non-aerosol generating procedures. And I would also add, Mr. Slade, that many of the members of the group I represent witnessed shortages well into 2020 and into 2021 among frontline healthcare workers. Were you aware of ongoing problems? And if so, again, how do you reconcile those ongoing problems with the statement that Wales never ran out at a national level?
I wasn't involved directly because these were matters dealt with by my colleagues on the health and social services side of Welsh Government and obviously out in the NHS. But I think we were aware at the top of the organisation that there were still concerns in places about provision of particular material and that work was going on within local health boards and with the shared services partnership and with local government where relevant to try and meet those needs as far as possible.
Can we move on, please, to the second topic, and that is supplies of PPE, specifically in care homes in Wales? We read at paragraph 321 of your statement, Mr. Slade, that the Welsh Government was not aware of any instances in care settings running out of PPE. Please, could we have up on the screen INQ 000 518 355 at page 19. This is the witness statement of Dr. Chris Llewellyn, the Chief Executive of the Welsh Local Government Association. And he says at paragraph 42, I'll read it out, local authorities and care providers were initially left to procure, store and distribute PPE for themselves or as part of regional arrangements. It was not until the Welsh Government moved focus away from the NHS and tasked shared services formally with supplying social care that stability and a basic level of supply was achieved across the wider care sector. By the 7th of May 2020, around 2/3 of the social care sector's needs were being met by shared services. Do you accept, Mr. Slade, that the PPE needs of care homes were overlooked in the early stages of the pandemic? And if so, why was that?
I don't think they were overlooked. There were conversations going on back in February about how best to get supplies into the care sector, and then those manifested themselves in the decisions taken in March to roll into the work of the shared services partnership the provision of supply into the care sector. In those early weeks, as I mentioned earlier in my evidence, colleagues in CPD were engaging closely with local government colleagues about helping local authorities meet their statutory needs as procurers of PPE for their care homes and their care settings. So care was very definitely in the mix early on, and it was very definitely part of what ministers wanted to do in terms of using the shared services partnerships capabilities. And I think we've already said as a government that in a future pandemic we would immediately move to involving provision for care settings into the work of the shared services partnership.
Does it follow from your last comment, Mr. Slade, that you'd agree with me that the response by the Welsh Government to supply care homes was slower than it could or should have been?
Colleagues, again, I wasn't answerable for this area, so I can only comment from what I observed. Colleagues were working incredibly hard to try and address all the issues arising from the pandemic, and colleagues were advising ministers. Ministers needed little persuading that the best thing to do once the pandemic was getting going was to roll provision to the care sector into the work of the shared services partnership, which I believe ultimately was helpful. And as you saw there from Chris Llewellyn's statement, by May, around 2/3 of all stocks were coming through the shared services partnership.
Yes, and just finally, before we move on from this, following what you said about helping local authorities out to meet their statutory obligations, was it not the responsibility of the Welsh Government via the shared services from the 19th of March 2020 to supply care homes?
It was a partnership with local government through the shared services partnership, as I understand it, to get the stocks out to joint equipment stores so that they could be distributed at a local level.
Thank you. I want to ask you thirdly and finally about lessons learned. At paragraph 376 of your statement, you cite the Welsh Government's internal review into its pandemic response published in September 2020, and that review described some of the difficulties in sourcing and distributing PPE to the social care sector, particularly given partners focused on health rather than social care. Can we have up on the screen, please, INQ 000 410950, page 13. Mr. Slade, this is another statement from Dr. Chris Llewellyn, prepared for an earlier module, in fact, module 2B, which is decision-making and political governance. He says this in relation to lessons learned, paragraph 53. In the view of the Welsh Local Government Association, the key lesson learned should be that we need collective and inclusive planning led by the Welsh Government with a whole systems approach engaging all partners who have a role to play. Local government is concerned that this learning is being lost and we might revert to the situation of inadequate planning and readiness for the next national emergency. And in oral evidence, Mr. Slade, Dr. Llewellyn reported that there was no appetite for a whole systems approach. insofar as supply and distribution of PPE is concerned, do you agree that the Welsh Government approach lacked, and I quote, collective and inclusive planning, and did not demonstrate a whole systems approach?
I don't know is the short answer to that question in relation to work that was led by other parts of Welsh Government. All I can say is that I think a collective and inclusive approach is the right way to go, drawing on the infrastructure and the learning that we have. And I believe all of that will be tested in a national UK pandemic exercise later this year. So we'll find out how much of that learning has stuck and how our systems are performing.
And meantime, Mr. Slade, do you share his concerns that there is no appetite for a whole systems approach?
No, I don't. I'm not quite sure what point that is being made there, if I'm honest.
Well, he explains that it is about not involving the local authority and not involving directors of public health at a health board level. That's what he's talking about when he says whole systems approach.
Well, if I can make the distinction, the key thing here is to make sure that all relevant parties are involved. We do have now well-established civil contingencies arrangements across Wales, which involve action at the strategic and at the local level. The local government are heavily involved in those resilience fora, and a lot of planning is done working very closely with local government. And I have to say, having worked in different bits of the system across the UK over 3 or more decades, relations between Welsh Government and local government are strong. The relationship between central government in the Welsh context and local authorities is as strong as any I have seen in other bits of the system.
So in short then, Mr. Slade, you don't agree with Dr. Llewellyn on that point?
We may be making the same point in slightly different ways, I think is perhaps what I'm saying.
I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Parsons. You referred there to the UK-wide national exercise, Mr Slade. As you may know, in my Module 1 report, I refer to the fact that lessons weren't learned from previous exercises. So you and I both will be looking to see whether any lessons have been learned as a result of all the terrible things that have happened. Anyway, we'll have to wait and see what that produces. Thank you very much indeed for your help to the inquiry, and thank you for being one of the most effective witnesses when it comes to answering questions focused in a focused way and without speaking too quickly. As you may also know, I've had a number of witnesses who speak as quickly as I do. So thank you very much indeed for your help.
Thank you, my lady.
I shall adjourn now. I've been asked to give a slightly longer lunch because an issue has arisen overnight, so I shall return at 1:45. Thank you.